Welcome to Backroom, where gangster stories meet calm sleep. Here, we share the quieter side of history, the dreams and lives behind the legends, told softly to help you drift into peace. Tell us where you're listening from, and one good thing about your day. If you enjoy the stories, like and subscribe. Your support keeps these midnight tales alive. Now close your eyes and let the night take over. The city wakes before the sun does. Los Angeles, somewhere in the early 1970s heat, already gathering in the pavement, dust shimmering like ghost light in the air. The streets stretch long and wide, indifferent to those who walk them. Palm trees lean like tired sentinels over cracked sidewalks, and from somewhere in the distance, a siren cries, its echo swallowed by the smog. This is South Central, where dawn doesn't promise renewal, only exposes what the night tried to hide. A young boy walks alone down Avalon Boulevard. His name is Stanley Williams, though the streets will one day call him Tookie. His shoulders are square, his stride deliberate. There's something about him, a stillness that feels like pressure before thunder. Around him, the world hums with contradictions, laughter and anger, survival and despair, all woven into the rhythm of a city that never really sleeps. He passes boarded-up shops and houses sagging under the weight of neglect. The air smells of tar, gasoline, and fried food d'ordinary sense, yet somehow heavy, as if each carries a story of someone who tried and failed to leave. Every face he passes carries the same tired defiance. People here have learned that the world outside these blocks doesn't see them, unless they're breaking something. Tuckie's eyes are sharp, always searching, always measuring. He's not afraid, but there's a restlessness in him that never fades. He's 15, maybe 16, and he already understands that respect is not given, it's taken. His father left years ago, his mother working long hours that keep her away until the moon climbs high. The nights are long, the walls thin, and the streets loud with arguments, laughter, and gunshots that blend into a single, unsettling lullaby. He learned early that power was the only language anyone listened to. Teachers tried to reach him once, but words meant little when the lessons of survival were taught outside the classroom. The system didn't break, it simply ignored him until he became invisible. Invisibility, he decided, was worse than death. As the morning sun bleeds through the haze, the light glints off car windows, liquor bottles, and the sweat on Tookie's skin. He stops for a moment at a corner where the paint has faded from a wall tagged in blue. The letters are crooked, bold, some early mark of what's to come. A few boys laugh nearby, tossing a football across the street. They call out to him. He doesn't answer, not yet. He just watches, like a soldier studying a battlefield he's about to enter. The narrator's voice softens, as if speaking from far away. Every empire begins with an illusion of belief that strength can protect you from pain. For Tookie's strength wasn't vanity. It was armor. At home, there were moments of tenderness, his mother's quiet hum while ironing clothes, the soft smell of starch and soapbutt. Even those faded quickly against the noise outside. The streets offered something else, recognition. Here, a man could matter, even if it was through fear. That was enough for a boy desperate to be seen. The 1970s were changing everything. Drugs flooded neighborhoods already drowning in unemployment. The civil rights dream had begun to sour into something more complicated, anger without direction, pride without structure. The Black Panthers had faded, their energy scattered into the wind. leaving behind young men who had inherited the desire for power, but none of the discipline. The police came like storm raids, arrests, brutality, all of it, feeding the same quiet rage that lived in every back alley, and in that vacuum, the streets began to organize themselves. It started small groups of boys banding together for safety, claiming blocks like kingdoms. They painted their colors on walls, on shoes, on flags. They spoke of brotherhood. But what they really built was territory. Tookie stood at the edge of this new movement, watching, absorbing. He was too intelligent to rush in, too proud to follow. But every day, the call grew louder. He saw the respect those boys commanded, the way people stepped aside when they walked by, the way their names carried weight. He wanted that. Not for greed, but for validation, for proof that he existed. At night, he'd stand by his window, looking out at the street lamps flickering in the distance. He'd hear laughter, sometimes gunfire, sometimes both, and think about what kind of man he was supposed to become. Society offered no answers. The streets, though they were ready to teach, they always were. The narration slows, the words sinking into silence. Tookie Williams didn't set out to build a gang. He set out to build a family, one that couldn't leave him, one that couldn't be taken away. But families born in violence rarely stay pure. In these early days, the mood was almost innocent, a raw form of rebellion before it hardened into something lethal. Tookie and others like him believed they were taking control of their destiny. They were wrong, but they couldn't see that yet. The blue flags, the signals, the swagger, all of it felt like belonging. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. The sun climbs higher now, bleaching the color from everything it touches. Children play near fire hydrants, splashing in the spray, their laughter briefly piercing the heaviness of the air. Somewhere, a radio crackles with soul music smooth, voices singing about love and heartbreak. But beneath it all lies a quiet drumbeat of inevitability. As Tookie reaches the end of the block, he looks back over his shoulder. The streets stretch endlessly in both directions. Behind him, the world of childhood. Ahead, a kingdom made of concrete and fear. Somewhere deep inside, a thought forms, half pride, half warning. If no one protects us, we will protect ourselves. It is a promise he doesn't yet understand he'll keep, and it will cost him everything. The scene fades slowly, the sound of the city softening into a low hum. The camera of the imagination lingers on him, a silhouette against the blinding California sun. A boy on the edge of legend. In this moment, before the first shot is fired, before the newspapers and trials and death row confessions, there is only potential. Pure, dangerous, radiant potential. The narrator's voice lowers to a whisper. Sometimes, the seeds of destruction are planted in the name of protection. And sometimes, the heroes of their own streets become the ghosts that haunt them. The light dims. The day begins. And the story of Tookie Williams, the man who would co-found the Crips, takes its first breath beneath the unrelenting California sun. It began with an idea, not of crime, not of conquest, but of unity, in the restless heart of South Central, where every street carried its own unspoken rules. A quiet revolution was forming. It didn't come from politicians or preachers or the promise of a better tomorrow. It came from two young men standing beneath the glow of a flickering streetlight. Stanley Tookie Williams and Raymond Washington. They were opposites in many ways. Raymond quick, wiry, sharp-eyed, with a smile that could disarm anyone. Tookie broad, deliberate, built like a man carved from the very concrete he walked on. Yet both carried the same fire in their chests, the belief that no one would protect their people unless they did it themselves. The world around them had already made its judgment. Young, black, and poor meant disposable. But together they decided to rewrite that story. They called their creation the Crips. At first, it was just a name whispered among friends, a word that meant safety, belonging, power. It spread like wildfire across neighborhoods, hungry for protection, for pride, for purpose. To them, blue wasn't just a color. It was a declaration, a shield, a language. The early days of the Crips were almost naive in their purity. They talked about defending the community, keeping drugs out, standing up to police brutality and rival groups that preyed on their blocks. It wasn't about destruction, it was about survival, about carving out dignity from a world that denied them even that. Tookie would later say that what they built was meant to be a brotherhood, but brotherhoods born in violence never stay innocent for long. In those first months, their meetings were small, held in alleys behind liquor stores or in the dim light of basketball courts long after dark. Cigarette smoke hung heavy in the air, laughter echoing between cracked walls. There was an energy, there's something electric, almost sacred. They believed they were untouchable, that by banding together, they could build a new kind of order. The streets began to change. Whispers spread, names carried weight now. Colors divided neighborhoods that once blended together. Blue flags appeared tied around wrists, tucked into pockets, waving from car windows like small banners of rebellion. For Tookie, it was intoxicating. For the first time, he felt what he'd always wanted. Control. But control is a fragile illusion, especially when it's built on fear. Soon, the same unity that brought them together began to draw enemies from every direction. Other groups formed in response, each claiming their own territory, their own version of power. The peace they'd wanted was replaced by a constant state of alertness. Paranoia became a kind of faith. Still, in those days, Tookie's charisma was undeniable. He could walk into a room and silence it. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence spoke louder than words. To the young men around him, many without fathers, without guidance, he was more than a leader. He was proof that they mattered. They followed him not because they feared him, but because he made them believe they could rise above their circumstance. Every handshake, every nod, every late-night talk about loyalty and respect, all built a mythology. Yet beneath that mythology, shadows were growing. Violence crept in quietly at first, like smoke under a door. A fight at a party. A confrontation gone wrong. Blood spilled on the same streets they once swore to protect. Each act was justified, defense, pride, but every drop drew them further from what they once stood for. The line between protector and predator blurred until it disappeared completely. Tookie began to feel it, the shift, the weight of leadership pressing on his chest. The brotherhood he built with his own hands was no longer something he controlled. It was something that controlled him, and yet he couldn't turn away. He was too deep in it now. The Crips had become larger than either founder. They were a movement, a culture, a myth in the making. In the midst of it all, there were moments that still felt pure. Nights where the group gathered to talk about dreams, cars, money, music, women. Tookie would listen, half smiling, the cigarette smoke curling round his face. He knew they were kids pretending to be kings. But in a world that stripped them of crowns, pretending was a kind of rebellion too. The narrator's voice lowers, steady, reflective. When you build something to protect yourself from pain, you often end up protecting the pain itself. By now, the Crips was spreading street by street, block by block. Each new member carried the same mix of loyalty and fear. Rivalries ignited like brush fires. South Central became a patchwork of war zones, each side convinced they were defending their own. Police patrols increased. News reports began to whisper the name Crips with growing unease. What started as brotherhood was transforming into legend, and legend, as history shows, always demands a price. Tookie's mother noticed the change. He'd come home later, quieter. The light in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something harder, colder. She'd ask him where he'd been, and he'd shrugged. There were no words to explain the kind of power he was tasting, nor the danger that came with it. He knew he was being pulled toward something irreversible. But how do you stop when the world has already decided what you are? When the only way to survive is to become the very thing they fear? The scene shifts, the sun setting over the rooftops of Los Angeles. The light turns gold, then blood orange, before fading into shadow. Boys in blue walk down the street in formation, heads high, their laughter echoing through the dusk. Behind them, walls bear their marking symbols of belonging, of defiance, of a dream curdling into nightmare. The wind picks up. A blue bandana flutters loose from someone's pocket, carried away into the gathering dark. It catches on a fence and trembles there, waving softly like a flag of unity, a flag of division, a flag of both pride and grief. As the night deepens, the camera of the mind pans out. Los Angeles sprawls beneath the smoky horizon, glowing faintly under a haze of neon and dust. Somewhere in the distance, a police siren wails, then fades. The brotherhood Tookie built now lives on its own, breathing, growing, consuming, and in that moment, one truth becomes clear. What begins as protection can become a prison. The narrator pauses, a heartbeat of silence. Blood made them brothers. Power made them enemies. The blue flag flutters one last time, catching the reflection of a passing car's headlights. Then, slowly, it falls to the ground. The city once pulsed like a living heartbeat, a rhythm stitched together by youth, rebellion, and blue flags fluttering in the dry wind. But by the late 70s, that rhythm had begun to slow. The streets of Los Angeles were changing. Asphalt that once shimmered under sun now seemed dull, lifeless, heavy with ghosts. The laughter that once spilled from porches and corner stores grew scarce, replaced by the sound of sirens, their cry like a mechanical warning, echoing through narrow alleys where dreams went to die. Mothers pulled their children inside before dusk, locking the world out with trembling hands. Windows became barriers, and silence replaced conversation. Fear had become the new language of the streets. Tookie Williams, once a name spoken with awe, now carried a weight of suspicion. Power had expanded his reach, but it had also built invisible walls around him. Every handshake could hide betrayal. Every glance might carry envy. He had once believed he was building a brotherhood, a code of loyalty carved from struggle. But brotherhoods born from fear rarely stay pure. The very streets he fought to protect were now soaked with uncertainty, and the Crips, once a symbol of unity, had fractured into smaller kingdoms. Each hungrier, each colder, the city no longer felt like home. It felt like a chessboard. Rivalries grew like weeds. Out of that same soil of neglect and anger, another force began to rise. The Bloods. They were not born from opposition alone. They were born from reflection, a mirror image of everything the Crips had become. Red against blue, pride against pride. The city watched as a new line was drawn, invisible but real enough to divide neighborhoods, schools, and families. One color could decide a man's fate. Tookie saw it happening, the mutation of something he once thought noble. What began as protection had turned into predation. He could feel it in his bones, in the way conversations now ended abruptly, in how laughter felt forced, or how the young boys who once looked up to him now spoke his name in whispers. Leadership had become a cage, and inside it, paranoia festered like rust. Some nights, when the city was quiet enough to hear his own breath, he would stare into a cracked mirror in his small, dimly lit room. The face that stared back at him no longer resembled the young man who once dreamed of order. His eyes were harder now, the light dimmed by the weight of survival. The reflection fractured his image into pieces, as if even the glass refused to show him whole. Outside, the streets were colder than ever. Streetlights flickered like dying candles, casting long shadows that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He could sense betrayal in every step, in every conversation. Old friends turned strangers. Strangers turned threats. The organization that had once been his family now felt like a trap, each corner hiding eyes that watched too closely in those moments. A strange melancholy would settle over him, not guilt, not fear, but something quieter, regret for what had been lost, the sense of purpose, the youthful fire that once believed in something more than power. The city had given him fame, but it had taken his peace. He still walked the streets at night, his broad shoulders cutting through fog like a blade. Dogs barked behind fences as he passed, and somewhere in the distance, a police helicopter traced circles in the sky. The air smelled of gasoline and dust, the scent of a city exhausted by its own pulse. He could hear muffled music from a passing car, laughter from a block away, then silence again. Always silence. Leadership, he realized, was lonelier than he had imagined. Every man who reached the top carried a crown made of thorns. He thought of Raymond Washington, his partner, his equal, and how even their bond had grown distant. They had shared a dream once, two boys trying to build strength from brokenness. But power changes the shape of friendship. Where there was once trust, there was now calculation. Every alliance had a price. The Bloods moved in like a rising tide. Red replaced blue on corners that once belonged to him. Old loyalties shifted, and the streets became a patchwork of colors and codes. Violence spread not like fire, but like frost, slowly, quietly, freezing everything it touched. There was no single war, no grand moment of collapse. Only 1,000 small fractures, spreading until the foundation gave way. And in those quiet hours, when even the city seemed to hold its breath, Tookie would ask himself the question he had long avoided. Had he created order or chaos? He remembered the early days, the laughter of boys who believed they were building something lasting, the shared meals, the feeling of belonging. He remembered promising protection to kids who had none. But now, those same kids carried guns. They killed in the name of colors, in the name of loyalty. But loyalty to what? To him, to a dream that had already begun to fade. The streets were no longer alive with the energy of youth. They were haunted by it. Every alley, every corner carried echoes, voices of those who never made it out. Tookie could feel them around him, unseen but present, reminding him that every kingdom built on fear eventually devours its king. As dawn crept over Los Angeles, The light fell pale and blue on empty roads. A breeze stirred the dust, and a lone blue bandana lay abandoned on the sidewalk. Faded, torn, its edges fluttering weakly in the morning wind. It was more than a symbol now. It was a memory. He picked it up once, years ago, as a badge of pride. Now, it felt like a relic of something that had turned against him. The color still shone faintly under the light, beautiful and mournful all at once. The color of loyalty, the color of loss. Tookie stood there for a long moment, the city sprawling out before him, endless, hungry, indifferent. He had wanted power to bring control, but power only brought distance. The city no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the streets, and the streets had turned cold. He let the bandana fall from his hand. The wind caught it, carried it down the road, twisting and tumbling until it disappeared into the distance, like a memory fading into the mist. And as he turned away, the faint sound of sirens began to rise again. The city was awake, and so was the reckoning that waited just beyond the next sunrise. The nights grew louder in Los Angeles. The sound of helicopters no longer startled anyone. They hovered like vultures above the city, their spotlights cutting through the haze in slow, methodical sweeps. Radios murmured in unmarked cars, voices coded and clipped. The hunt had begun, and the prey was no longer just another man on the street. It was Stanley Tookie Williams, the myth that walked like a shadow among legends. The walls were closing in, though no one could yet see their shape. He felt it before he saw it. The air itself seemed to tighten, the city shrinking around him. Every corner he turned, every motel room he slept in, carried the faint echo of pursuit. There was no longer safety in numbers. The same men who had once called him brother now avoided his gaze, whispering in corners, their loyalty dissolving under the heat of police interrogation rooms. Power had once made him untouchable. Now it made him a target. Neon lights bled across wet pavement. It was always night in this chapter of his life, a long, sleepless night filled with engines idling and footsteps echoing down alleyways. He moved like a lion pacing a cage he could not yet see, the walls invisible but closing in all the same. Every sound was amplified, the hum of fluorescent lights, the creak of old floorboards, the crackle of a police radio somewhere far but not far enough. In those days, the city itself seemed to watch him. Murmurs filled the bars and pool halls, stories of Tookie's strength, his defiance, his temper. The legend grew taller even as the man grew tired. He had become both feared and admired, a ghost of power that people could project their fantasies onto. But the legend had taken on a life of its own. It no longer needed him to survive. Law enforcement had begun to shift. What once felt like random raids now had a rhythm, a strategy. They studied his moves, his habits, the places he returned to when no one was supposed to know. They understood what every predator learns too late, that strength leaves footprints, and pride leaves patterns. The man who once commanded streets now found himself watching them from behind drawn blinds, whispering to himself that he still held control, though deep down, he knew control was slipping like sand through open hands. There were nights he would sit alone in a dark room, the only light coming from a flickering television screen. News anchors spoke his name with rehearsed caution, their voices somewhere between condemnation and awe. Crip leader, gang kingpin, most wanted. The titles stacked upon each other like stones on a grave. Tookie would stare at the screen, at the distorted reflection of his own face in the glass. and wonder which version of him the world truly saw, the man or the myth. Outside, the city seethed. Betrayals multiplied like cracks in a windshield. Each fracture started small, a rumor here, a lie there, until suddenly the whole thing shattered. Old friends turned informants, their words traded for freedom. A single whispered name could erase years of loyalty. The blue code that once bound them had become a threadbare illusion, stretched too thin by fear and self-preservation. Tookie's paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted anyone, not the faces he grew up with, not the men who claimed to still follow his lead. Every phone call was suspect, every knock at the door a test. He moved safe houses often, switching cars, burning through cash that no longer felt like wealth, only fuel for survival. And in those moments of stillness between the chaos, he would hear it, the distant hum of a helicopter tracing slow circles in the night sky, as if marking time before his inevitable fall. Power, he realized, had its own gravity. Once it pulls you high enough, escape becomes impossible. The raids came suddenly, then frequently, doors splintering, lights flooding into rooms like the dawn of judgment. But Tookie was always gone just hours before. He knew the streets like a map drawn in his bones. Every alley, every shortcut, every sympathetic face behind a locked door. Yet each escape felt emptier, each victory smaller. The adrenaline that once thrilled him now curdled into fatigue. It wasn't triumph anymore. It was postponement. There was one night, a night that felt colder than the rest, when he stood on a rooftop overlooking the city. Below him, light stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a glowing organism that pulsed with life and indifference. He thought about the boys who had once walked beside him, their laughter carried on summer nights, their dreams so loud that even the city seemed to listen. Now, most of them were gone, buried, locked away, or lost to the fog of addiction. He wondered if this was what leadership meant, to outlive the people who believed in you. But the city was done believing. It had turned its gaze elsewhere. The morning of his capture came quietly, almost without warning. The sun was just beginning to rise, staining the sky a bruised grey. He had been staying in a small apartment, curtains drawn, coffee gone cold on the table. He heard it first, the distant rumble of engines, the low hum of radios crackling in synchronization. Then the sudden bark of orders, feet pounding upstairs, a door splintering. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The myth of Tookie Williams, the lion of the streets, stood still, staring into the flashing red and blue lights spilling through shattered windows. There was no struggle, no grand resistance, just the heavy silence of acceptance. The roar that once shook neighborhoods was gone. All that remained was breath, steady, resigned. When they cuffed his hands, the steel felt cold, unfamiliar. He didn't fight it. In that instant, he understood something the city had been trying to tell him for years, that every story of power ends the same way. In stillness, they led him outside. The helicopters hovered above, cameras flashed, reporters shouted his name into the air like a ritual. But to Tookie, their voices were distant, muffled, meaningless. He looked once toward the horizon, the city that had made him, the city that had destroyed him, and for the first time, he felt small beneath it. The lion had been cornered not by men, but by time, and as the car door closed behind him with a hollow thud, the world outside seemed to fade. The flashing lights reflected in his eyes, red and blue merging into purple, the color of surrender. For a moment, there was no noise, no anger, no fear. Only the slow realization that the true battle was no longer out there on the streets. It had moved inside him. Silence, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that hums against the walls, thick, metallic, alive. It was the first thing that greeted him when the steel doors clanged shut. The echo lingered longer than it should have, settling into the bones of the building, into the marrow of the men who lived there. The world of motion and noise had vanished behind him. The streets, the voices, the rhythm of life, all replaced by stillness and the low, endless hum of fluorescent lights. Stanley Tookie Williams sat on the edge of his narrow cot, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the small square of light that crept through the barred window. Morning, noon, or night, it didn't matter. Time had lost its edges. The days folded into one another, indistinguishable, like identical pages in a book no one wanted to finish reading. He could smell the iron, not just in the bars, but in the air itself. It tasted like rust and sweat, like regret made physical. Somewhere down the corridor, a man shouted, his voice cracking in anger or madness, but the sound barely broke the monotony. Most of the time, there was nothing but the creak of beds, the occasional cough, the scuff of boots against concrete. The prison was alive in small, mechanical ways, breathing, moving, whispering through pipes and vents, but inside his cell, it was a different world. He had been caged before by loyalty, by power, by the rules of the streets. But this was different. There was no empire to maintain here, no brotherhood to command, no blue to wear, no myth to feed. Just himself, and that was the hardest opponent he had ever faced. At first, the rage stayed with him. It burned through his nights, turning sleep into a battlefield. He replayed the betrayals, the arrests, the news stories, the looks on faces that once admired him and now looked away. He cursed the world, the system, the invisible hands that had shaped his fate. He flexed his muscles until they trembled, as if the strength that once made him a legend could still tear open the walls. But walls are patient. They wait. They outlast everything, even fury. Eventually, rage gave way to silence. Not peace, but a quieter kind of torment. He began to notice things he had never cared about before. The rhythm of the guard's footsteps, the way the light changed tone as the day aged, the delicate swirl of dust in the air. He noticed his own breath, slow and heavy, echoing back at him in the narrow room. Prison stripped him of everything external, leaving him alone with the sound of himself, and that was where the real reckoning began. There was a small desk in his cell, its surface scarred with initials carved by men who came before him. One day, he picked up a pencil, not to write, not yet, but to hold it. It felt strange, fragile, almost absurd compared to the weight of a gun, but something about it unsettled him. A weapon that created instead of destroyed. Days turned to weeks before he began to use it. At first, it was just words, disconnected thoughts scribbled on scraps of paper. Questions, memories, fragments of a life too large to fit between concrete walls. But soon the words began to form patterns, sentences, reflections. The pen scratched across paper like a whisper against stone, small but persistent. Writing became survival. In the silence of his cell, words replaced noise. Each one peeled back a layer of himself he had long buried beneath anger and pride. He wrote about the boy who once wanted respect more than anything else, and the man who had mistaken fear for respect. He wrote about loyalty, and how it decays when built on blood. And somewhere between confession and clarity, he began to glimpse something he hadn't seen in years himself. Stripped of myth, the other inmates called him the General. Some respected him, others resented him. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the prison settled into its uneasy slumber, he was no general at all. He was just a man staring at the slow drip of time through an unseen crack in the ceiling. There were nights when guilt crept in like a shadow under the door. He would think about the lives tangled in his story, the mothers who buried sons, the children who grew up under the flags he helped raise. Their faces blurred, but their absence was sharp. It pierced him in moments of stillness. Guilt didn't scream, it whispered. It sat beside him in the dark and spoke softly of consequences. And yet, within that weight, something began to shift. For the first time, he wasn't trying to justify his past. He was trying to understand it. The violence, the pride, the hunger for belonging, they were all languages he had learned too young. In a world that offered no other dialect, he began to see how every decision had been a translation of pain. In that understanding, the cell began to change. The same four walls that once felt suffocating now became mirrors. They reflected back not who he was, but who he might still become. Redemption, he realized, wasn't a destination, but a slow process, like light leaking through cracks. He started reading, too, books on philosophy, history, religion, the words of men who had faced their own prisons, some literal, others invisible. Their thoughts resonated in the cold air. He began to grasp the irony, that confinement, the thing he once feared most, had given him freedom of another kind, the kind that begins in the mind. Sometimes, when the lights dimmed, he would lie on his back and listen. Beyond the walls, somewhere far away, life went on, cars passing, laughter echoing faintly in the night. He imagined the streets of South Central, the corners where he once stood like a sentinel. He pictured the blue bandanas, the symbols, the codes, all fading into history. Maybe this was how legends die, not with violence, but with understanding. The men around him still measured time in sentences and parole hearings, but for Tookie, time had become something else. It was a teacher. Every hour in solitude stretched long enough to hold entire lifetimes of thought. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He wasn't sure he deserved it. What he sought was comprehension, a fragile bridge between who he had been and who he might still be. In the stillness of his cell, he began to sense a truth he had never known on the outside, that power built on fear dies with the body, but the power of words might outlive it. As the lights flickered overhead, he looked at the last sentence he had written. The ink was still wet, trembling slightly from his hand. Even a lion can learn to kneel. He stared at the words for a long moment before setting down the pen. Somewhere beyond the walls, dawn was breaking, soft, quiet, indifferent, and, in that faint light, the question lingered in the air like the breath before a prayer. Can a soul ever truly escape its past? In the stillness of his cell, the sound of pen against paper became his new heartbeat. It was faint, fragile, yet more powerful than the roars that once echoed through Los Angeles streets. The same hands that once commanded fear now traced soft lines of ink across white pages. The same voice that had ordered chaos now whispered lessons of peace. Stanley Tookie Williams began to write, not to boast, not to justify, but to reach the children who had inherited his mistakes. His first stories were simple, told through animals and symbols, but behind every sentence lived the ache of repentance. Each word was a step away from the darkness that had defined him. In the early mornings, when the light crept through the bars like silver dust, he imagined young faces on the other side of the world reading his words, perhaps seeing another way. He wrote about choice, about courage, about the thin line between pride and destruction. He remembered what it felt like to believe you were invincible, and how easily that belief turned to ruin. The act of writing became prayer, each paragraph a confession without altar. He spoke to a generation that had been taught to survive, not to dream, and slowly the world began to listen. Letters started, arriving children thanking him for his stories, teachers reading his books in classrooms, activists calling him a voice of change. For a man once named Monster, it was a strange kind of resurrection. Yet redemption is never unchallenged. Outside the prison walls, newspapers questioned his sincerity. Victims' families asked if ink could wash away blood. To some, his words were nothing but a desperate performance. To others, they were the miracle of transformation itself. Tookie read every letter, those filled with hope and those dripping with hate. He did not answer them all. He simply kept writing. In the silence of confinement, the noise of the world became irrelevant. What mattered was the honesty of his pen. Days fell away like pages torn from a book. He sat by the narrow window, feeling the tremor of helicopters above and wondering if his stories would ever outfly the ghosts of his past. The prison smelled of bleach and steel, a reminder of the boundaries he could not cross. But inside his mind, entire cities bloomed streets where children laughed without fear, homes unscarred by gunfire, playgrounds untouched by grief. In those imagined worlds, he found the man he might have been. Sometimes he would pause, stare at the faint reflection on his metal sink, and whisper to himself, "This is how I fight now." Words as weapons not to wound, but to heal. The same rhythm that once dictated violence now became cadence for truth. He wrote until his fingers cramped, until his eyes burned. Every page he finished felt like one less stone on his conscience. When his first children's book was published, it reached classrooms he would never see. Teachers spoke of it as a bridge between pain and possibility. Young boys who once admired the Crips began to question what heroism meant. Some called him hypocrite, others called him savior. Tookie called himself a man still learning how to live. He knew the world's memory was long, and forgiveness, if it ever came, would arrive slowly, if at all. But he didn't write for absolution. He wrote because silence was death. The letters multiplied. Some carried drawings from children, others carried arguments from skeptics. Each one reminded him that his life was no longer his own, it belonged to a conversation larger than crime or punishment. Late at night, when the fluorescent lights hummed and the guard's footsteps echoed down the hall, he would sit on the edge of his cot and imagine those young readers turning his pages by lamplight, unaware that the man behind the words lived and breathed within a cage. He began to understand that the true weight of his legacy would never be measured in the number of people he once led, but in the number he could now guide away from the path he chose. His books were humble, almost naive, but they carried sincerity born from scars, and in a world starving for sincerity, that was enough to stir hearts. Journalists began to visit, writing articles about his transformation. Cameras returned, though this time not for mugshots or trials, but for interviews about redemption and social change. His name once symbolized terror. Now it provoked debate. Could a man who once created chaos become an instrument of peace? Could literature cleanse what violence had stained? Those questions hovered over him like shadows that refused to leave, and perhaps they were never meant to. Tookie himself didn't seek to answer them, he simply kept writing, because in the act of creation he found the smallest fragment of freedom. The rhythm of sentences, the weight of commas, the pause between lines became part of a private symphony of survival. When news arrived that he had been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, he laughed softly, half disbelief, half humility. The irony was not lost on him. The co-founder of one of the world's most infamous gangs, now considered for humanity's highest honor. But beneath that irony was something purer recognition that even in ruins there could be seeds of light. The nomination did not erase his past, nor did it promise forgiveness. It was simply acknowledgement that transformation, however painful, was possible. He spent that night awake, not in celebration, but in quiet thought. The noise of the prison faded to a hum, and he listened to the rain tapping against the window bars. Each drop felt like time cleansing itself, 1 second at a time. He realized that words could not undo what had been done, but they could prevent what had not yet happened. In that realization lay the fragile power of his redemption. Tookie's pen rested beside him as dawn approached. The first light touched his face through the bars, painting his skin gold for a brief, forgiving moment. He smiled faintly, not as a man seeking glory, but as one who had finally found purpose in the smallest act, a line of ink across paper. His story had changed shape, not because he rewrote history, but because he dared to face it. Somewhere beyond those walls, a child might open one of his books and read the words of a man once lost to darkness, now reaching out through time, whispering softly that it's never too late to begin again. The world outside his cell had changed, but the weight of his name had not. Stanley Tookie Williams, once the co-founder of the Crips, now an author, a symbol, a question that society couldn't answer. His final years unfolded like a quiet storm, heavy with reflection and reckoning. The noise of youth had faded into a deeper silence, the kind that only time can carve. He was no longer the man the world once feared, nor the saint some wanted him to be. He had become something in between, an uneasy truth, caught between redemption and retribution. Beyond the prison walls, a movement was growing. Activists, poets, and teachers rallied in his name, not to erase his crimes, but to honor his change. They carried candles through the streets, their light trembling against the dark December air. Outside San Quentin, strangers held signs that read "Save Tookie," their voices merging into a solemn chant. They spoke of second chances, of transformation, of the right to evolve. Yet, just as many others stood on the opposite side, families who had lost sons and daughters to gang violence, victims who still lived with invisible scars. For them, forgiveness felt like betrayal. Justice, they said, must not waver for sentiment. The air between these two truths was charged with sorrow and conflict. Inside his cell, Tookie felt both sides. He had known the cost of his choices long before the courts had decided his fate. At night, when the sound of footsteps faded and the corridors sank into stillness, he would think of faces he could not name, the ones buried beneath headlines, the ones who never grew old. Their memories followed him like ghosts that neither accused nor forgave, only existed. He wrote about them in his journals, not as justification, but as acknowledgement. He knew that every word he wrote was also a reminder of what could never be undone. The days leading to his hearing for clemency were slow, deliberate. Time no longer moved in hours, but in thoughts. He received letters by the hundred supporters from across the world pleading for mercy, critics demanding justice. Each envelope carried a fragment of humanity's divided conscience. A few came from people he had never met, but somehow had changed through his writings. A child who said his books kept him away from the streets. A mother who forgave a son lost to violence. A teacher who believed even the damned deserved grace. He read them all, quietly, his lips moving without sound. In courtrooms and offices, his life was reduced to arguments and signatures. Lawyers spoke of rehabilitation, of moral awakening, of the Nobel nomination that had once made the world pause. Prosecutors reminded everyone of the bodies, the blood, the past that could not be rewritten. Each side spoke truth, yet neither held the whole of it. Because truth, like redemption, rarely fits inside clean lines. The media swarmed. Cameras camped outside prison gates. Microphones caught the sobs of protesters and the fury of victims' relatives. The nation watched a debate far larger than one man about the meaning of justice itself. Can a murderer change? Should he be allowed to live because he learned too late? Or must punishment remain absolute, even when the soul evolves beyond its crime? These questions filled the air, unanswered, echoing through newsrooms, churches, and schools. Meanwhile, Tookie waited. He ate little, spoke less. The world outside buzzed with noise, but his own grew quieter each day. He had already made peace with one truth, that his life, however long it lasted, now belonged to others. If the state wanted to make an example of him, so be it. If they spared him, he would continue to write until his last breath. Either way, he refused to plead. "Let them judge the man I am now," he once said, "not the boy I was then." On the eve of the governor's decision, the prison glowed with flickers of candlelight. Beyond the fences, hundreds gathered, singing softly into the cold. Some prayed for mercy, others for closure. Above them, helicopters hovered, their blades cutting through the nitre. Grim reminder that this was still the machinery of the state, not of grace. Inside, Tookie sat at his desk beneath the same flickering bulb that had lit his books. He folded a final letter, addressed to no one. His handwriting was steady, almost serene. In it, he wrote about peace not as a reward, but as a choice. Even in the cage, he wrote, a man may still walk free inside his mind. As dawn approached, a knock came to his door. The sound was gentle, almost respectful. A guard handed him a folded document, the governor's decision. There were no speeches, no ceremony, just ink on paper, cold and final. The request for clemency was denied. The words seemed to absorb the air round them, leaving the cell hollow. For a long moment, he simply stared at the page. There was no anger in his face, no disbelief, only stillness. Outside, the crowd broke into cries, some of grief, some of satisfaction. The governor, standing before cameras miles away, spoke of accountability, of justice served. Yet even in victory, there was no triumph. The air itself felt heavy, as if the world understood that something deeper had been lost. Tookie folded the letter neatly, placed it beside his pen, and leaned back against the wall. The noise of the world faded once more into the rhythm of rain against steel. He closed his eyes and breathed slow, measured, accepting. He had spent a lifetime learning that power and pride are prisons of their own making. Now, even as the end neared, he felt freer than he ever had when he ruled the streets. The guards passed by his cell without a word. Somewhere beyond, a clock ticked toward the inevitable. The governor's rejection was not just the closing of a file, it was the final reminder that redemption, no matter how genuine, cannot always rewrite the past. Yet, as the storm outside deepened, a strange calm filled the space. Judgment had come, not from the law, but from life itself. And in that silence, heavier than any verdict, Stanley Williams sat unmoving, neither saint nor sinner, only human. A man who had fallen too far, risen too late, and still managed to teach the world that even in darkness, the soul can search for light. The paper beside him trembled slightly from the draught through the barred window, as if the words themselves were breathing. Judgment was done. But the story, his story, was not over. Night fell over San Quentin with a kind of fragile quiet, the kind that presses against the walls and lingers in the air like breath. The corridors were dim, the lights softened by the fog that crept from the bay. Every sound carried weight, the shuffle of boots, the rattle of keys, the distant hum of the generator that never seemed to rest. It was the final night of Stanley Tookie Williams, and though the world outside spun with debate and noise, inside this place, time had slowed to the rhythm of a heartbeat. He sat alone in his cell, dressed in simple denim blues, his hands folded on the table before him. There was no tremor, no pleading, only stillness. He had written his last letter earlier that evening, each word chosen carefully, as though the act of writing itself could steady the soul. On the paper, he thanked those who had believed in change, who had seen beyond the headlines. He asked for peace, not for himself, but for those still trapped in the same cycle he once ruled. The young men chasing respect down alleys that led only to graves. Outside his door, guards moved with subdued precision. Their voices were hushed, their footsteps measured, as if even they understood the gravity of the hours ahead. Procedure dictated their every motion, yet something in their posture betrayed unease. It was not sympathy, but recognition that tonight, the system would take a life that no longer resembled the one it condemned. The warden arrived briefly, nodding with mechanical formality. Papers were exchanged, signatures confirmed. The metallic scent of ink mingled with the sterile temps of disinfectant that hung in the air. Every object seemed sharper, more defined, the dull glint of the keys, the cold shimmer of the metal door, the faint reflection of Tookie's face in the reinforced glass. He rose slowly when they called his name. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. He walked the narrow hallway flanked by two guards, his steps echoing softly against concrete. Somewhere, a clock ticked steady, unrelenting. He did not look back at his cell. The walls that had held him for decades were no longer his world. Instead, his gaze stayed forward, toward the faint rectangle of light waiting at the end of the corridor. The hallway opened into a chamber washed in pale fluorescence. There were no windows here, no clocks, no measure of night or morning. The room was neither cruel nor kind, it was simply indifferent. In the center stood a narrow gurney, its leather straps already laid open like silent questions. Stainless steel counters gleamed under the sterile light, their surfaces white spotless, erasing any trace of what came before. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and cold metal. Tookie took a breath. It came out steady, deep, deliberate, the inhale of a man who had already made peace with what awaited him. He turned briefly toward the small glass window that separated him from the witnesses. Behind it, journalists scribbled notes, officials sat stiffly, and a few supporters pressed their hands together in prayer. Among them was a woman holding a folded photograph of a child, a reminder that this moment carried countless meanings, each shaped by loss, love, and memory. A chaplain stepped forward, offering quiet words that dissolved into the hum of machinery. Tookie nodded once, grateful but detached. His faith was no longer in words, but in acceptance. For years he had battled himself, searching for redemption not in the eyes of others, but within his own heart. Tonight, he would meet whatever came with calm resolve. The straps were fastened around his wrists and ankles. The leather was cool, smooth, almost gentle. The needle slid beneath his skin with practiced ease, the line connecting him to the machine that pulsed faintly at his side. For a brief moment, the silence seemed to stretch, to bend time itself. The guards stepped back. The warden gave the signal. He closed his eyes, and the world slowed. He thought of his mother, her voice soft as she called him home as a boy. He thought of the cracked sidewalks of South Central, of the laughter that used to fill them before it turned to sirens. He remembered Raymond Washington, his friend and brother in the beginning, and how the streets had swallowed them both. He remembered the letters, the children who said his books had changed them, the teachers who thanked him for speaking the truth. He thought of the nights spent writing under the hum of that single flickering bulb, each sentence a step away from the man he used to be. The needle hummed, his breathing slowed. A stillness filled the room that seemed to draw everything inward, the lights, the walls, even the breath of those watching. The air itself grew heavy, as though holding a final note. He opened his eyes once more, not with fear, but with a kind of wonder, as if seeing the world one last time without the burden of judgment. In that instant there was no sound, no protest, no applause, no forgiveness spoken aloud, only silence the purest kind, a silence that held within it every word he had ever written, every tear ever shed for him, every moment of violence and remorse that had carved his life into legend. And then the room fell still, no movement, no sound, only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft, rhythmic drip of the four-line. The guards stood motionless, the witnesses quiet. One by one, their heads bowed. The warden checked his watch and nodded once to the recorder. Time was marked, officially, irreversibly, but outside, beyond the prison walls, the night went on. The rain that had begun earlier now fell harder, washing the sidewalks of San Quentin, sliding down metal fences, mingling with candle wax and tears. Reporters stood beneath umbrellas, speaking into microphones, but their words felt small against the enormity of the moment. The world had not ended. It had simply changed slightly, silently, in a cell that now stood empty. A single scrap of paper lay on the table, the ink still wet. Redemption is not about forgetting who you were. It's about becoming someone better, even when no one believes you can. Outside, the candles flickered in the wind, their flames bending but unbroken. The same streets where he once ruled, where fear once reigned, now lay under the same rain that fell the night he died. Somewhere, a young boy opened one of his books and began to read, and though the man was gone, his story remained, haunting, flawed, human. The rain whispered against the pavement as dawn crept over the horizon, and then there was only silence. The world did not go silent when Stanley Tookie Williams died. If anything, the echo of his name grew louder, traveling beyond the prison walls, beyond Los Angeles, beyond the myths of the streets that once claimed him. His story began to shift shape, retold in classrooms, documentaries, and whispered prayers. Some saw him as a monster who could never be redeemed. Others saw him as proof that redemption, no matter how late, still carried meaning in the years that followed his execution. His books, those handwritten reflections born under the dim flicker of prison bulbs, found their way into schools, libraries, and broken homes. Children who never knew the sound of gunfire read his words about peace, unity, and the trap of violence. Teachers would pause between lines, their voices trembling, realizing that these pages were written by a man who had once ruled with fear. Journalists revisited his life, peeling back the layers of myth and memory. They found a man of contradictions, leader and a destroyer, a killer and a mentor. Each article, each documentary, became another attempt to understand the impossible balance between sin and salvation. And perhaps that was the point. Tookie's legacy was not about finding an answer, but about living with the question. Former gang members, once his enemies, now older and slower, spoke of him differently. Some remembered the violence, the chaos he unleashed. Others spoke of the day they read his books and felt something shift inside them. A few had tattooed his name beside the word redemption, believing that his fall had freed them in ways his power never could. In South Central, murals of Tookie appeared, some painted with halos, others with tears. Each one told a different version of truth. For some, he remained the Crip founder, the man who unleashed a storm. For others, he became a cautionary saint, a man who paid his debt and still tried to give more. The irony was never lost how the same street that once feared him now carried his message of peace. Time softened his image, not through forgiveness, but through distance. The outrage of his crimes faded, leaving behind a complicated legacy, one that forced people to question how far a man could fall before rising in spirit. Even the guards who had watched him for years spoke quietly about him. They described a man who no longer looked like the legend on TV, just someone who bowed his head in thought, who wrote letters to children he would never meet in the prison archives. His handwritten manuscripts still lie in boxes ink smudged by hands that once held weapons. They are relics now, not of innocence, but of awakening. Each sentence carries the weight of time lost, and yet they breathe with life. His story lives on in unlikely places, on stages where poets recite his verses, in community centers where his anti-gang initiatives still echo, and in the dreams of young men trying to escape the cycle he once helped create. To them, Tookie is not a hero. He is a reminder that even when the world forgets you, your actions, good or evil, continue to ripple through time. Late at night, when rain falls softly against the windows of Los Angeles, you can almost feel his ghost walking those streets again. Not as the Crip founder, not as the condemned man, but as a shadow among many watching, perhaps hoping that the next generation will choose differently. The narration slows, reflecting not on crime or punishment, but on consequence and legacy. The hum of life continues, sirens, whispers, the murmur of a city that never really sleeps. Somewhere, a teacher reads one of Tookie's children's books aloud. Somewhere else, a mural fades under the weather. And in between those moments, his name lingers like a prayer no one is sure how to finish. History rarely deals in absolutes. Heroes fall, monsters repent, and between them lies the truth that no man is ever entirely one or the other. As the final echoes fade, the narrator's voice softens into a whisper. He built a world from violence and tried to tear it down with words. He could not escape his past, but he faced it. And in that, perhaps, there was redemption. The screen fades to black. The rain continues. The story is over, but the echo remains. South Central sleeps differently now. The sirens still hum in the distance, but softer like a memory fading into the hum of night. The streets that once throbbed with anger and adrenaline now breathe a gentler rhythm. Neon signs flicker over corner stores. The same cracked sidewalks carry new footsteps, smaller ones, unaware of the ghosts that walk beside them. Time has not erased the scars, it has only learned to live with them. The rain begins to fall, steady and slow. Drops tap against broken glass and rusted fences, each one a whisper of what once was. The narrator's voice moves through this quiet cityscape like a drifting thought, weightless. Observing, there was a time when these same streets trembled under the shadow of one man's choices. But tonight, the air holds something different. Peace, perhaps. Or maybe just exhaustion, the kind that follows decades of chaos. The world Tookie built, ruled, and destroyed has evolved without him, reshaped by those who watched him fall and those who dared to rise after in the hush of midnight. A mural of Tookie watchers from a wall of face caught between pride and regret. The paint has begun to peel, but the eyes remain. They see the children walking to school in blue hoodies, unaware of the meaning that color once carried. They see the candles still lit at memorial corners, the mothers who still look up at the night sky and whisper names that never grew old. The narrator's tone softens, turning inward. What does it mean to change? Can a man's final acts outweigh his first? Or are redemption and guilt forever bound, like two halves of the same heartbeat? Tookie's story was never just about violence. It was about transformation born in chains. In that small, dim cell, he found something the streets had never given him. It was in that silence he began to see clearly that true strength wasn't control or fear, but surrender. The kind of surrender that accepts one's past not as a wound to hide, but as a truth to carry. Outside those prison walls, life moved on, but within his words, his reflections, his voice, something remained alive. His plea for peace echoed across generations, spoken by teachers, activists, and even by those who once called him enemy. The man who once glorified power had, in the end, dedicated his final years to dismantling it. The pacing slows. The soundscape narrows. Only rain, breath, and thought. Redemption, the narrator reminds us, is not about absolution. It is not about forgetting. It is about the willingness to face oneself completely, to sit in the dark and still seek light. And perhaps that is the silence of redemption, not applause, not forgiveness, but understanding. The streets glisten under the rainfall. The same corners that once traded death now echo with laughter from children too young to remember. And yet, somewhere beneath that joy lies a whisper of the past. A story passed from one generation to the next, not as warning, but as wisdom. In the final moments, the voice grows distant, reflective, almost reverent. The world remembers Tookie Williams as many things: a founder, a fighter, a convict, a writer. But beneath all those titles was something more human, a man searching for peace in the wreckage of his own making. The rain thickens. The camera of imagination drifts upward, over the city, over the rooftops still wet with memory. Below, the streets shine like veins of silver beneath the glow of street lamps. Life continues. Forgiveness lingers in the air, not as a gift, but as a question left unanswered. The story does not end with redemption, nor with damnation, but with stillness. In every soul, the narrator whispers, lies both the destroyer and the redeemer. The story of Tookie Williams is not one of crime, but of becoming human. The screen fades to black. Only the sound of rain remains. and then